Shading has the power to take a simple line drawing of any subject and turn it into a compelling drama with glowing highlights and rich dark shadows. Good shading can bring beauty and drama to even the simplest of subjects. One of the most common questions I get from students is how to shade drawings properly. But a lot of students really struggle to develop a shading process, a set of steps that allows them to understand how to shade their drawing and how values relate to one another. In this video, I'm going to teach you the 5-step shading process that I use to shade my drawings. This process is the foundation of all of my shaded drawings. You can use this process to shade nearly any subject, from very simple objects like spheres or fruit and vegetables to much more complex subjects like the human figure. The process I'm about to teach you will ensure that you always know exactly how to shade any subject you're drawing, no matter how complex. You will always know what to do next and how values relate to one another. The shading process will make sure you have a clear division between light and shadow and that all of your values are properly related to one another. This is the 4th video in my shading series. If you have not yet seen those other videos, I highly recommend watching them. You can find a link in the description. The videos in my shading series will ensure that you have a deep understanding of light and shadow and how to get these ideas into your drawings. Now, before we get into the shading demonstration, we need to make sure that your drawing is ready to be shaded. So before you shade your drawing, you need to have worked out the basic shapes and proportions of your subject. If a head is too big or an arm is too long, you want to deal with that before you start shading. No amount of good shading, no matter how skilled you are, will fix issues with proportion or form. So you need to solve that first. So in the drawings you're going to see me shade today, I've already figured out the basic forms and proportions. But once your drawing is ready to be shaded, you can apply this process. One final note before we begin. The subjects you're going to see me draw have all been lit with a single light source. I highly recommend drawing subjects that have been lit with a single light source. That will ensure that you have a full range of values from bright lights to deep rich darks. On my website, you can find free access to reference images of subjects that were lit with a single light source. So let's head to the drawing board so I can show you how this works. So in this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to apply this 5-step shading process to a very simple object like a sphere. After this demo, I'm going to show you how to apply it to the human figure, which is a much more complex subject. Now, if you're at the point where you're ready to start shading, you should already have a good sense of how to get your drawing to about this stage. We have the basic shapes of the subject worked out. Now, this is just going to be a drawing of a simple sphere, so I have the shape of the sphere, which is of course just a circle, and I have the shape of the cast shadow, which is just a simple oval. So the first step of the shading process is to divide light from shadow. And we're going to do that first using the line of termination. So for this drawing of a sphere, the light is coming from the upper left, which means that the lower right portion of the sphere will be in shadow. So first, I'm going to draw the line of termination. I'm going to divide light from shadow. Now on a sphere, of course, the line of termination is going to be curved. So you can see I'm just drawing it lightly at first, just to get that basic division. Now, once I have divided the light side of the sphere from the shadow side using the line of termination, I'm going to darken all of the shadow areas at about a number 3 value, which, if you remember, is the reflected light value. So I'm going to darken the entire shadow area with that value. Now, later on in the shading process, we're going to get much more specific about the values, but right now, everything is going to be 1 value. Just going to have it be approximately a number 3 value. Now, one thing you can note here is that even though we only have a simple wash of value, already this begins the process of the sphere looking 3-dimensional. Now, of course, we're going to do a lot more than this, but this begins that shading process. So that is step number 1. Divide light from shadow using the line of termination, and then darken all shadow areas, regardless of what they will eventually become, to approximately a number 3 value. For the second stage of the shading process, I'm going to darken the core shadow. Now on a sphere, the core shadow is going to be a triangular shape of darker shadow. Now, if you remember, we have light coming from the upper left. This means that the upper left portion of the sphere is going to be in light, with the lower right being in shadow. But when the light comes down and hits the surface that the sphere is resting on, it bounces back up and throws some reflected light on the bottom of our sphere, which leaves this darker band visible, and that is the core shadow. So again, the core shadow is going to be this darker band of shadow, and on a sphere it's going to be a bit triangular. So I'm going to just put the edge of the core shadow here, and I'm using very soft lines because on a curved object, all of the shadow edges will be pretty soft. So once I have the shape of the core shadow, I'm going to darken the core shadow to approximately a number 4 value. Now I'm just trying to get the rough shape and the rough value at this point. I can always go back and refine later, which you're going to see me do in just a few minutes. But right now, I just want to separate the core shadow from the reflected light. So that's step number 2. You want to draw the shape of any core shadow of the subject and darken all core shadows to about a number 4 value. Now here we just have one core shadow, but of course when we get to more complex objects, you're going to see far more complex core shadows. Step number 3, we're going to darken the cast shadow. Now the cast shadow is the one area of the drawing where we're going to bear down on the tip of the pencil and bring part of the shadow all the way to black. So what you're going to see me do is switch to the overhand grip so I can bear down on the tip of the pencil. So I'm going to darken this edge here. And then bearing down on the tip of the pencil, I'm going to darken this to about a number 5 value. Now it's always important to note when you're shading, you don't have to nail the value on the first pass. So here, I'm drawing pretty dark, but I'm not using the full weight of the pencil. I just want to get it started. Remember, drawing is a transparent medium, so when you shade, or when you draw anything, you'll be able to see all of the previous strokes through any new strokes you put on. So we can work our way up to the darkest value. Now you'll note that the edge of the cast shadow right underneath the sphere is pretty hard edged. But as the cast shadow gets further from the sphere, that edge can soften. Now remember, I can always go back and refine these values. We're just getting them started. But hopefully you can see that just drawing these 3 shadow conditions, the core shadow, the reflected light, and the cast shadow, we are already getting a sense of 3-dimensionality. Now again, these are just the rough shadows at this point, but hopefully you can see how 3-dimensional this starts to make our sphere. So that was step 3. Darken the cast shadows to approximately a number 5 value, the darkest value on your value scale. Now before we move on to the lights, I just want to address shadow edges for a brief moment. Now because the sphere is rounded, on the sphere itself we're not going to have any hard-edged shadows. So at the line of termination, where the sphere goes from light into shadow, you can see it's not a hard edge, it's a little diffused. You can see the transition from the core shadow to the reflected light is even softer than the transition from the lit side of the sphere to the shadow side. Now the cast shadow is hard-edged, particularly right underneath the object, and depending on the light, the edge of the cast shadow can start to soften as it moves away from the object. But getting these shadow edges is an important part of the shading process. So we've arrived at step 4. In step 4, we're going to draw the center lights and the highlights. So for this step, we're going to move out of the shadows and into the light. Now I'm drawing on this beautiful blue paper, so I'm going to add my lights using a white pencil. Now if you're drawing on white paper, you achieve the lights by letting the white of the paper shine through. But on dark paper, I need to add lights with a white pencil. Now before I add white pencil, I always like to clean up the drawing just a little bit. Anywhere I'm going to add white pencil, I like to make sure that there's no dark pencil. So I'm just going to use my eraser to clean it up. So first, I'm going to draw the center light. Now the center light occurs when light comes down and hits the top left of the sphere. That part of the sphere is going to be the brightest. And as the sphere slowly begins to turn away from the light, the sphere will become a little bit darker until, of course, we get to the line of termination where it fully turns away from the light and goes to shadow. So to draw the center light, I'm going to start at the upper left. And it's not quite going to be a number 1 value, but it's pretty bright, and I'm going to brighten the sphere, and as I get closer and closer to the line of termination, I'm going to see less and less light. So as I said before, we don't need to get this on the first pass, so I can do a couple of passes here. But the idea is that the sphere is brightest on the upper left, and as we approach the line of termination, this light gets more dim and more dim. So hopefully you can see this gradation here, where the sphere is brightest at the upper left, and as we go toward the line of termination, it's a little more dim. The center light can be subtle, but particularly before we draw the highlight, you can really get a sense of what this looks like. Finally, we get to the highlight. The highlight is going to be the moment where light comes down from the light source, hits the sphere, and is reflected directly into your eyes. And it's going to create this bright spot on the sphere. So that's step number 4, drawing the center lights and the highlights. So at this stage, we have all of the values we're going to draw on the sphere. Now, of course, it's a little rough, so this brings us to step number 5, refinement. At this stage, we're going to take what we've started and we're going to refine it in order to really pull out the values. Now, the refinement stage will mean different things for different drawings. But since we're drawing a simple object like a sphere, what is likely to happen is I will darken the values that we have. I will pay close attention to the shadow edges, which means I may soften the line of termination just slightly here. I'm going to darken the reflected light just a little bit. I'm going to darken the cast shadow more. Now, the refinement stage will last till the end of the drawing. Now, your goal at this stage is to maintain the division of light and shadow that we've worked so hard to accomplish. This is critical, that all of the darkest values, your number 3, 4, and 5 values, are only found on the shadow side of the line of termination. And our 2 brightest values, our 1 and 2 values, are only found on the lit side of the line of termination. So we want to keep the values that we've established so far. No matter what details or subtlety you add, you want to keep all of the values that we've established. This is how you achieve powerful shading. Now, of course, it is also critical to note that the sphere is sitting on a surface that's in an environment. So, if you're so inclined, one thing you can do is darken the environment that the sphere is in. Now, adding these kinds of atmospheric strokes is not an essential part of the shading process when you're shading an object like a sphere, but I did want to include it in the refinement stage. So here you have it. Step 5, refining your values and your drawing. This could include darkening your values, paying more attention to shadow edges, darkening the area around your subject, or any other refinements that will help bring your drawing to a sense of completion. So hopefully this gives you a strong sense of the shading process. No matter how complex my subject gets, this is the exact shading process I use in nearly every drawing I do. So if you're struggling to keep your lights and shadows separated, or if you're struggling to figure out what kind of steps or process you need to go through to shade, this is what I would highly recommend. It is a 5-step shading process that uses a 5-step value scale. But as long as I'm maintaining these values, I will have a drawing that is dramatically shaded with beautiful bright lights and rich dark shadows. So hopefully you can now get a sense of how a drawing that starts off with that shading process can be refined until it becomes a very detailed and dramatic shaded drawing of a sphere. Now at this stage, I could take this drawing as far as I wanted. I could continue to refine it, soften edges, make it even more detailed, but I'm really liking the way that the values are starting to work together here. I want you to note that this drawing keeps a very clear division of light and shadow. Our 3 shadow values are only found on the shadow side of the line of termination. We have our number 3 value, which is our reflected light value, number 4 value, which is our core shadow value, and our number 5 value, which is our cast shadow value. These values are only found on the shadow side of the line of termination. And we also have our 2 brightest values only found on the lit side of the line of termination. We have our number 1 value, which is the highlight, and we've drawn our center light, which starts near a number 1 value and heads toward a number 2 value. Now you'll notice that I haven't discussed midtones yet. Now the midtone in this drawing accounts for anything on the lit side of the line of termination that is not the highlight. Those are all considered midtones. But instead of thinking about them as midtones, I like to think about it as the center light, which tends to start bright near the light source and fade toward the line of termination. I feel like that gives me a much better sense of how the light actually works. So this drawing does of course have midtones in it, but I just don't tend to think about them as I'm shading. I'll discuss this a little bit further when we get to our more complex subject. So now that you have a sense of how this 5-step shading process works, let's apply this to a much more complex subject, the human figure. So here we have a much more complex subject, the human figure. Now this is where having a shading process really pays off. When you're just working on a simple object like a sphere, shading can be pretty straightforward. But with a subject like this, there is so much more visual information that you need to have a strategic process that makes sense to you so you don't forget where you are, so you always know what to shade next. So even for a complex subject like the figure, the shading process is essentially the same. So for the first step, we're going to divide light from shadow, starting with the line of termination. So I'm going to start up here in the torso, the largest form, and I am going to draw the line of termination with my pencil very lightly. And at this stage, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I can always go back and add complexity, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple. And I want you to note here that I'm using the side of my pencil to create a light, soft line. This is not a dark, heavy line. It's pretty light and soft. So again, I'm simplifying quite a bit of the line of termination here because I can always go back. But remember, I want to start simple and move toward complexity. So here you can see I have the line of termination for the torso. Now I'm going to draw the line of termination going down the leg, using, again, a light, soft line. And when I get to complex areas like the knee, I might simplify it a little here. I'm not going to include every tiny undulation on this first pass. Next, to divide light from shadow, I want to darken all of the shadow side to approximately a number 3 value, the reflected light value. So far, I've just worked with the big forms of the body, but now I can go and draw the line of termination on any remaining parts of the body. Again, using a light, soft line. Just going to add some value here, that number 3 value. And I'm going to move over to the other arm. Again, I can see a clear line of termination dividing the lit side from the shadow side. So just like with our sphere, the light is coming from the upper left, which means that the lower right of all of these forms is going to be in shadow. Now, just this one simple step starts to create the illusion of light and shadow. So that is step 1, dividing light from shadow. So right now, I've divided the light from shadow on the torso, this leg, and the arms. And now, of course, I can go and do the other leg. And again, I'm just doing a simple pass at this point. I don't want to include every undulation or detail. And of course, I can come up here to the face and do the same thing. And I'm going to darken the hair. This model's hair is very dark, so I'm going to go ahead and darken the hair as well, even though technically it's not a shadow. So that is step 1. Divide light from shadow, first using the line of termination, and then by adding value to all of the shadow areas. Remember, we're doing that number 3 value, the reflected light value. Next, step 2, the core shadow. Now, on a subject as complex as the human figure, the core shadow can be quite complex. Remember, the core shadow is going to be that dark band of shadow immediately to the right of the line of termination. Now this is where we get to add some detail and some complexity here. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to go down the line of termination and add quite a bit more complexity. So now I'm trying to capture these smaller undulations that I may have missed on my first pass. And you can see when we start to work with the core shadow, the illusion of three-dimensionality starts to come out even more. And of course, as we darken the core shadow, it leaves the reflected light at that number 3 value. So we can already see this differentiation between the core shadow and the reflected light. So I'm going to soften the edge between the core shadow and reflected light because we don't want that to be as firm as the core shadow edge at the line of termination. Start to darken it down the leg here. And once again, it's important to remember that I am not attempting to capture every undulation at this point. I'm not trying to capture every tiny shift in value. This is just a first pass, and I can go on and add complexity as needed. Now, I highly recommend you study anatomy at some point, but one of the nice things about using a strategy like this is that you can render anatomy even if you don't know exactly what's underneath the skin by capturing these shadow shapes and edges. The knee is a great example. You can get all of these bones and tendons rendered even if you're not entirely sure what's underneath there. Now, let's move on to step 3, cast shadows. Now, in a subject like this, we don't see the ground plane, so we're really looking for areas that the figure casts a shadow over itself. So one of the most prominent areas is right here. We actually see the shadow of the head cast over the neck and the upper torso. So we're actually going to darken this with the tip of the pencil and going all the way to black. And this shadow is also casting over the arm. Now we also have a cast shadow where the pectoral muscle casts its shadow into the armpit. So we can darken that to black as well. So at this stage, you can really start to see the illusion of light and shadow coming out. And areas like this are really beautiful, where you start to get a sense of the core shadow, the glowing reflected light, and then the deep dark cast shadow on the other side. I'm going to darken the cast shadow of the arm here just a little more. And I want to remind you, at this stage, we're not trying to capture every detail. We just want to get started. Remember, the final step is refinement, and that is where we will bring out all of the subtlety and detail. But first, right now, we need to get a lighting scenario that works. The light must be logical. It must make sense. We must keep our lights and our shadows separate. So hopefully you can start to see the illusion of light and shadow come out in this drawing. Next, step 4, center lights and highlights. So before I add any white pencil, I want to clean up any area the white pencil is going to go. The reason we do this is because if there's any dark pencil, it will really start to sully the white. So we want to keep that white clean and by itself. We don't want any of the darker pencil to mix with the white because it tends to make a muddy value. So again, we have our light coming from the upper left, meaning that the upper left areas of the body are going to be the brightest and the lower right parts of the body are going to be the darkest. So when we're working with the center lights, we're going to add some white value to this upper left area. And the parts of the body closest to the light source are going to be the brightest. And as they move away from the light source, it's going to get dimmer. And we even have parts of the body over here that are picking up a bit of light as well. So there's our center light. And as I mentioned last time, this leaves our midtone. The color of the paper is roughly going to be the midtone. All right, now I'm definitely going to add more white pencil as the drawing progresses, but that is our center light. So that gives us that bright area of the form that is closest to the light source and facing the light source. And as the body starts to turn away from the light, we get that midtone, which in this drawing is the color of the paper. And finally, we have the body turn away from the light completely and go into shadow. So to complete step 4, we're going to move on to the highlights. Remember, the highlight occurs when a part of the body faces in such a way that light is reflected from the light source directly back into our eyes. And it's going to create a bright highlight. And this is where I bear down on the tip of the pencil to really start to create these bright pops of white. Now, highlights don't occur all that often, so we want to be pretty subtle with them, but they do add a very nice sense of three-dimensionality and vibrancy to the drawing. So hopefully you can start to see the light and shadow emerge in this drawing. Step 1, we divided light from shadow using the line of termination, and then we darkened all shadow areas to approximately a number 3 value. Step 2, we darkened the core shadow. We paid attention to the shape of the core shadow, and we added some complexity, and that core shadow was at number 4 value. Step 3, we worked on cast shadows. We darkened the cast shadow areas to a number 5 value. And that created our darkest darks in the drawing. Step 4, we worked with center lights and highlights with a white pencil. We created the center light first, leaving the midtone as the color of the paper, and then we added some bright highlights where the forms of the body reflected light directly back into our eyes. So these first 4 steps create the backbone of your shading. No matter what else happens in this drawing, we must retain these values. We must keep our lights separated from our shadows, and we want to keep this 5-value system intact. So it looks a little rough at this stage, but as the drawing continues, as I continue to refine and work on all of these shadows, the form will start to emerge more and more. But again, this is the backbone of your shading. So finally, step 5, refinement. At this stage, I have gone around the drawing and added a huge amount of detail and complexity. I have worked out some of the smaller pieces of anatomy, as you can see here on the knee. I have added a lot of subtlety in the shadow side, but no matter how much detail I have drawn, you can still clearly see all of those essential values that we talked about. We can see a clear division of light from shadow. Notice that all of our shadow values, values number 3, 4, and 5, are only found on the shadow side of the line of termination. And our 2 brightest values, our number 1 and 2 values, are only found in the light. So that initial lighting scheme we worked out, I have kept all the way through the drawing, even as I've added a lot of detail and anatomy. You'll also notice that I have added a lot of value around the figure to offset it. Now, I really love adding this kind of atmosphere to a drawing. I think it really makes it beautiful and dramatic. I recently had a student who said that some of my finished figure drawings look as if they were in a sandstorm. I really liked that description. Now, how far you take a drawing is entirely up to you. You get to decide when the drawing is finished. I think this drawing is probably 95% of the way there. But no matter how far you take a drawing, whether you want to leave it more abstract or do a photorealistic rendering, that lighting scheme that we initially worked out, that lighting scheme where we have our lights and shadows separated and we have done shadow and light based on that 5-value system, this is going to form the most important system of values. And we want to maintain that no matter how much detail we get. So by using this 5-step shading process and this 5-step value scale, you will always know how to shade any subject, no matter how complex. And hopefully you now understand that this shading process will work for simple subjects like basic shapes, spheres, cylinders, fruits, vegetables, as well as much more complex subjects like the human figure. And it's these complex subjects where the shading system really pays off because it allows you to organize highly complex information. So hopefully now you have a good sense of how this 5-step shading process works. Again, this is the shading process that I use to shade all of my drawings. Now, of course, there is a lot more to shading than just what I'm showing in this video, but this shading process should form the foundation of all of the shading you do. The more you learn about subtlety, detail, texture, or anatomy, all of these things can be folded back into this foundational shading process. So here's your project. Apply this shading process to your drawings. I highly recommend starting off with simple subjects like spheres, eggs, or even fruit and vegetables. Things like pears and apples work great. But you want to practice this 5-step shading process often enough so it becomes second nature, so you barely have to think about it. Once you've internalized this shading process, drawing simple subjects, you'll be ready to move on to more complex subjects. Children's toys work great for this. But once you're ready, you can apply this shading process to the human figure, the most complex and challenging subject. Now, when you're learning a process like this, Repetition is critical, so I'm going to go through these steps one more time to make sure you have a clear understanding of each step in the process. Before you begin shading, your drawing must be ready to be shaded. You want to have already worked out all of the basic forms and proportions. Once your drawing is ready to be shaded, step 1, divide light from shadow. First using the line of termination, and next by darkening all of the shadow areas to approximately a number 3 value, the reflected light value. In step 2, you're going to darken the core shadows, that band of shadow that is between the line of termination and the reflected light. You're going to darken your core shadows to approximately a number 4 value. This is an opportunity to start to add some detail and subtlety to the line of termination where your form shifts from light to shadow. Step 3, darken your cast shadows. You want to darken any cast shadow to a number 5 value, the darkest value. And remember, cast shadows often have hard edges as opposed to core shadows which have softer edges. Step 4, center lights and highlights. Now in today's demonstrations you saw me draw on colored paper, and when colored or tone paper, you're going to draw the center light with white pencil. It's going to be brightest near the light source, and it's going to get progressively dimmer as it approaches the line of termination. On the 2 drawings you saw me do today, the mid-tone is the color of the paper. But on white paper, you'll often have to add the midtones. So on white paper, you want to start with the midtone and get progressively lighter as you approach the light source. Also in step 4, you're drawing the highlights. On white paper, you're just going to leave the white of the paper to shine through, and that will reveal your highlight. And on toned or colored paper, you're going to draw in the white highlight with white pencil. And finally, step 5, refining your values. This is where you can go in and add all of the subtlety and detail that will really make your drawing sing. But remember, no matter how many details you add, you must maintain the clear values that we've talked about in this video. So once again, there's the 5-step shading process. Learn it, practice it, apply it in your drawings. I absolutely love to draw, and I love to share what I've learned with my students. So to support me in this endeavor, please like, subscribe, and share. Also, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, let me know, what are you struggling with in your drawings? What questions do you have? What do you want to learn? On this channel, I want to make sure that I'm answering the questions that you have and addressing your needs, so let me know how I can help. Now, if you're looking for a more structured and immersive drawing program, visit my website, brenteviston.com, where you'll find all kinds of drawing resources, and you'll learn how to enroll in my Art and Science of Drawing courses. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me. It's an honor to be part of your drawing experience, and I hope to see you in other videos.